Anyway, I'm really excited about the stuff that we're going to hear today. What Dwayne and Cornerstone, what they put together is pretty incredible. It's very helpful. I've had a little bit of a preview on it, so I'm pretty jazzed hearing it myself. Most of you know Dwayne McNally. He's actually on our association board, and he started. You're in your first year still.
Second year.
Oh boy, how time runs together. No, he's a really good.
When you get old, it happens that way.
So he's been a big ad. Dwayne's been around the association a long time. He's been an elder at Hill Country Austin. Was elder chairman there. I don't know how many terms he did there. Did you
Just one.
You know
but now I've got my my makeup round for the new church that we're launching.
Yeah, so you guys know they released Leander and
Steiner.
Ranch. So Dwayne's going with the Leander deal, so he'll be most likely. Yeah, you already are on the board. They voted all that. Yeah. Wow, I wonder if they knew what they were.
No. But feel free to call him, Danny.
Dwayne is working. He retired, but now he's working with as a COO for Mortarstone, which you can tell us more about it. But basically, they provide a service for churches collecting data and doing data analysis to help churches kind of maximize, their resources. And anyway, he's got a lot to say about giving trends, and I'm gonna pray for you, brother, and then we'll hand it over. Can I do that? Lord, thank you, Lord, for opportunity for us to give thought to this incredible responsibility that you give to us in leading your people about stewardship, about giving. Lord, I think about how you, through Paul, told Timothy, command those who are rich to be rich in the world to come and not lay up all their treasure, just quoting from Jesus. I just love that, Lord. We want to do this well. And sometimes, God, we confess we shrink back from saying all that we should say. And yet, Lord, we need to call people to give as an act of worship. Father, give us wisdom about this. And we thank you for Dwayne. Thank you for everything you taught him, his experiences, his ministry now. May you use them and make them helpful to us today. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen. Thanks, Danny. And Danny talked a little bit about my background and the things that I've done. I think the part that I want to add into that conversation is part of the reason why I do what I do is because of such an opportunity that God gave me in the late 90s. And I was at a Promise Keepers event, and the conversation came up. And I don't even remember what the conversation was, but the guy challenged us to tithe. And that wasn't something that I ever considered in the past. For me, giving was something I saw my parents do as they put their hand in their pocket and threw a wadded chunk of cash, not a chunk, a bill, into the plate. And went home that night and argued with my wife for 2 weeks. Sorry, Donna, if you listen to this, but she's heard me say it many times before. We argued for 2 weeks because we were barely, I think her perspective, she was working and we were barely able to figure out how to make it all work. After 2 weeks of that arguing, we came to terms with a 18-month plan to where we would be tithing. Long story short, 6 months later, she had quit work. We were tithing, and we felt more financially secure than we'd ever been in our life before. And so for me, this is not just a conversation about a job that I do, but it's a passion that I have to see people put Christ as the Lord as opposed to their pocketbooks as Lord. So anyway, just so you have that background as I go into this conversation, know that that's my heart in this, and it's nothing else from that. So hopefully this will be a conversation, so please engage. I'll just tell you some of the stuff I'm going to share with you guys. You guys may have different perspectives on that based upon what you're experiencing or what you're seeing. What I'm going to share with you is from a data set that we have across 517 churches that utilize our software, and taking a look at the last 4 years and what some of the trends are in giving that we see, but also talk through some of the implications that we believe are taking place based upon our data and other research that we've done. So feel free to challenge, feel free to jump in any way you want, but look forward to the fun and conversation. So just so you guys know, Danny talked a little bit about Moorstone. Moorstone's been around for about 13 years now, and it was started by a couple guys who were leading a capital campaign in their church and got frustrated because they had no data that could give them key insights into who are the givers, what are the conversations that they need to be having, and so they started out to build a piece of software. And so today the software, we utilize it to help churches engage their givers. So think about the fact of how do you take somebody who's been never given to where they give for the first time, but how do you cultivate that so they become, that actually giving becomes a part of their life. We help people through the lens of how do you disciple givers towards generosity. So we like to view those two things as, one is helping you with the quantity of givers, but then the other one is to help the quality of your givers. And so how do you help them take steps in their giving? Operate with excellence, so incredible reporting. I mean, I know Keith and the folks over there at City View are utilizing the software, but really giving you insights into no shortage of information. And then finally, really our real big desire is to help you lead with insight, not with intuition. Because the thing I would say is there were things that I now see sitting, so I was XP at Hill Country Austin for 8 years. There was things that I knew, or that I intuitively knew. There's now things that I actually know based upon data that I wish I'd actually understood better when I was in that seat. So anyway, I'm going to jump into the data set. So this is 537 churches, close to 1 million giving households, and $13.7 billion of gifts. And so that's the data set that we're operating from. And so I'll just walk into this, and like I said, the intention here is for this to be a conversation. So, but as we did it, we identified some top takeaways. One is the fact that across all the churches that we looked at, giving went up 19.6%. Inflation was 21%. And so as a church, if you feel like even though your giving is going up, but you feel like you're losing ground, it's typically because inflation has gone up 21% over the last 4 years. This is over the last 4 years. And so that's the thing, that this is from 2021 through 2024. And so inflation during that time period was 21%. So what does that mean for churches? Well, one, your cost of donuts, your cost of coffee, your cost of repaving your parking lot, your cost of your staff, all that is going up. What's it mean for your givers though?
Their giving dollars are shrinking.
Their dollars are shrinking, and the majority of them have not. Most people have not seen 20% increases over the last 4 years, and so they're stressed, or that gap is widening, and so that's one of the things that we see is the fact that the stresses on givers is actually increasing, not decreasing in this season. And I'll talk a little bit about this further on as well, but one of the things that, well, I'm just gonna wait on that, sorry. Another takeaway was that we saw that 50% of the people who gave to churches, to a church in 2021 did not give to the same church in 2024. So think about that. So 50% of the people who, if you had 100 people who gave to your church in 2021, only 50 of them gave to your church again. We don't know where those people went. We just know that they didn't give again in 4 years later, or 4 years later. And so the question is okay, what does that mean for you as a church leader? Well, it means you're living off of somebody else's definition of stewardship, because 50% of your givers, because the good news is all those givers were replaced, but the question is who taught them what giving and stewardship and generosity look like. The other implication is the fact of, we all know there's a ton of shifting sheep, so that's just further component on that. And so, the question is, as church leaders, what does that mean for you? So how does this strike you? What strikes you about this?
A lot of the financial problems churches face could probably be solved if 19 more people tithed.
Well, I'll get to that, the tithing number in a minute. And this is just, oh wait,
We still on the previous point?
oh, sorry. No, sorry. I was actually talking the wrong point. So, sorry. So, yeah, it's like, so you were like, what? What are we talking about? So, take breaths. Sorry. I need to learn my clicker. Sorry, let me go back to this point. So in 2024, what we found is, and so we take Census Bureau data, and it gives us median income, and so we match people's addresses to what the median income is, and from that, we identified that 8.9% of the givers across, those 100 plus, or those almost 1 million giving units, only 8.9% of them tithe, and that's of those who gave. So if you take a look at the majority of the research is the fact that 60% of the people in a church give, then that takes you down to 20% of the 1 out of 20 people actually tithe in the church. All right, now let me ask the question: what's the implications of that for you as a leader? Because the other point I'll make here in another minute.
I'm sure there's a ton of different things we could draw out of that, but you need to do some training. You need to do some stewardship education. You need to teach people what the Bible says about giving.
Because I think that's one of the things that as we look at this, and some churches obviously are higher than that, and but there's a lot of churches that I look at, and I talk to probably 15 churches a week in general, and probably about the majority of them are in the 2 to 5% of their people are actually tithing today, of the people who are giving, based upon the data. And I always view it as our data could be wrong, but even if it's half wrong, would we be satisfied with 16% of the people are tithers? Now, I think some of the things that I find is when I look at a lot of, because I look at a lot of survey data and a lot of other things, a lot of people say that they tithe. The question is what's your understanding of tithe versus their understanding of tithe? Because one of the things that I see more and more is that the definition of tithing and the definition of giving anything are beginning to blur quite a bit across a lot of the research and the stuff that I see. And so people will go and say, hey, I gave this. And for them, if you talk about your tithes and offerings or your tithes and your giving, they're blurring those conversations together because no one's typically taught them on what a true tithe is.
So they're just calling their gift a tithe, even if it's a 1%, 2%. They're calling it a tithe, meaning a religious gift to my church or something, rather than a 10%.
Religious gift to any organization.
Okay, I see.
So potentially, they are giving 10%.
But
they're
maybe 4 to your
1%
church,
to the
4
church.
to water wells in Africa, or 4
Right.
to...
And so they view that all as a tithe. And so depending on your definition of tithe, and I'm not going to argue the definition of a tithe, you guys are way better suited for that conversation. But the thing that I know is people are beginning to really look at, and I know I put a post out on LinkedIn a while back, and someone right away said, yeah, well, you're not looking at the total data of all the giving that they're giving all these other places to say that they're actually giving 10+%, which is awesome. But the question is the church plan A, or is the church just one of many plans that God has to accomplish the kingdom? And the other thing that I find and so I will make this point on this one, I don't know if you guys have paid much attention yet about what's happening right now as executive orders reduce funding of nonprofits. The amount of chatter that I'm seeing, because I follow a bunch of different philanthropic consultants, the amount of chatter that's going on right now about nonprofits stepping up their engagement with givers because of other funding dropping. If people believe that 10% is a tithe and it doesn't matter where it goes, and somebody else is asking them for dollars, they're not going to increase that 10%. They're going to actually reduce and readjust where those dollars are being allocated. And so we actually believe, as we're starting to watch some of the trends and some of the data, is that actually there's going to be more pressure on the people who are giving in your church to continue to give to your church, because a nonprofit that is talking to them is doing a better job of explaining the mission that they're about and what they're accomplishing for the kingdom than what potentially churches are themselves.
And those nonprofits are spending, on average, 8 to 10% of their budget to raise that money.
Absolutely.
So they're also like spending money to put on events and host donor events and send high quality communication and all that. So that's something else that I've just noticed as a discrepancy with, we kind of assume people will give, and a lot of the NGOs are like, no, we're going to invest resources to raise money, which has been kind of a mentality shift for me.
And I think that's really good, Keith, because the other thing is this week I saw a piece come across of a nonprofit consultant basically saying, hey, come, let's talk about, because what's going to matter for your people is that they have a sense of community, they have a sense of purpose, they have a sense of blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking at this as like, you're talking about a church. I mean, because what he was saying that the nonprofits needed to put in place is exactly what you would say that the church is supposed to accomplish in the lives of people. And so our nonprofits are going to do, well, one, as Keith said, they're going to be doing a better job of engaging your givers than what you are if you're not thinking through this lens. And they're also going to be trying to build what the church has been doing, because they talked about monthly gifts is, a nonprofit typically gets 40+% of their giving in December. Churches get roughly 18% in December. Why is that? Nonprofits do a better job of telling people about the power of the mission in December than what the church does. And so, and what the nonprofits are now saying is, you need to up that game every month so that you're engaging people monthly instead of on an annual basis. So all that to say is, our initial assessment is that chances are that 8.9% is actually going to drop over this next year without strong teaching and engaging by the church.
Well, I think don't you think part of that too, Dwayne, is explaining, and I could be off on this, but I agree with you about make sure that we're communicating our mission and vision and what we're doing as a church, but I go back to kind of Keller's like gospel ecosystem idea of like the local church, obviously the gospel, with the local church kind of being the hub around which nonprofits and parachurch ministries kind of orbit.
Yep.
That's compelling to me, but it's good because I'm a pastor. So I don't know, like, do you think that's compelling to our congregants to understand? Like, I think we all as pastors know that nonprofits and other organizations call us when they need volunteers, when they need support, and that we're shepherding and discipling people that are then serving in all of these mission agencies and nonprofits and those kind of things. So I'm not negative about all those other organizations, but I kind of understand that if the local church goes away, those things are in trouble.
Right, just like government funding being reduced, those organizations are, so I totally agree with you. And I think, Keith, and I think we talked about this after the last board meeting or something along those lines, but that is a core part of the conversation is our people have to know the power of the church with the nonprofits. Because I think the average person in our church doesn't understand the linkage.
They just kind of see them as all.
They see them and
Yeah.
by the way, the nonprofits aren't singing the praises of the churches typically when they're out there and saying, hey, Jarius, your church has already given this much money and we thank you for the gift that you've given to your church to be a part of that. That's not the conversation they're having. They're saying, for us to survive, we need you to give to us. And I think that is stepping up quite a bit right now. And so just as we can all, celebrate the fact that, okay, great, we're gonna have less tax dollars that we have to pay, in theory. We'll figure that out. But the key is the fact of there's actually a challenge for us as a church, but there's also an opportunity because where the nonprofits start to not be able to meet needs, we can step into that space, but we have to have the funding to be able to do that. And so that's where this is a big conversation. Holland?
Yeah, I think especially among like the younger generation, there's kind of an assumption that churches will just be fine, but like nonprofits and those type, the parachurch ministries, man, that's where your giving is needed. They're accomplishing these real XYZ goals, but churches will probably be fine, and then the nonprofits have no problem doing what you just said, unapologetically explaining, if you do not give to us, we will not exist.
Right.
Whereas churches either shy away out of fear of looking like a money grab or over spiritualize, and with like it, it's God will provide is true, but won't go the route of like God wants to provide through you.
Holland, I totally agree with what you're saying. I was actually having a conversation with somebody earlier this week on this data, and they're like, "Well, it's God's church; He can do whatever He wants." And I'm like, 100% agree. And I can bet you that the average church in Europe, who is now a museum, thought the same conversation at some point in time.
Right.
And it's the obedience of the leadership to actually engage and challenge people, as Danny prayed about what Paul instructed Timothy. If we're not willing to live with what Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 6:17 and through 19, command those, who's going to teach these guys? And that's where the other stat that I thought I was talking about, apologize for that, actually points to is the fact that if people are shifting, and if there's no one teaching and instructing and discipling, we are now back to whatever culture says about giving becomes the voice, not what the church and what the scripture talks about giving.
Can you tie like the first point to the second point a little bit when you were talking about inflation? About obviously that's like churches have felt it, but obviously our people have felt it too.
Yep. And so the nonprofits.
Right. Yeah. And so like on the second takeaway, when you talk about tithing, do y'all have historical data on that at all to know like has tithing gone down as inflation's gone up, or like I'm trying to, like what you were saying, trying to understand when I teach my people about it, what are they experiencing? Because we've said for years, this is kind of going like the FPU route. Like if somebody's buried in debt, you can tell them all day to tithe, and they're like, I'm trying to dig out of this hole,
Yeah.
But I wonder how much inflation is related to that. Like, are they feeling pressure with their own expenses that's pressing up against what we're saying about what God says about giving?
And I'd have to go back and look at our data, and I can do that, Keith. What I've seen though from other studies, and we're the only data-driven analysis that I'm aware of. Almost everything else is based upon survey data. I know your view of survey data, but I'd rather take hard data any day. But when we did the report a year ago, which was looking at 2018 through 2023, because we were looking at we took on this one, we tried to take the COVID factor out of it because things shifted during COVID dramatically. And actually, I think tithing shifted during COVID more so than anything else, but I'd have to go back and look at last year's report. But there is a correlation there. Yeah. So this is the one I thought I was talking about earlier. So I'm sorry, but this is the one that talks about 50% of the households that gave in 2021 did not give
Wow.
a gift to the same church in 2024.
Wow.
And so the implication, as I said earlier, that I was talking about, was the fact that, think about that over 6 years.
That's big.
So who's teaching the people who are in your seats? Or what basis do they have for giving in generosity? It's most likely, if you haven't taught on it in the last 2 years, probably 30+% of your people don't know what you believe about generosity and giving.
It's so good. That's such a good point.
And so, if they went to Keller's church or Keith's church or something like that, you might be fortunate, but there's a ton of churches out there who don't do giving moments. They don't teach on it. They don't disciple on it. And trust me, I talked to a bunch of those churches. And I'm like, so how do you ever hope to change someone's life by having them confront that their money is their Lord without that conversation? And so that's the part that for me on this one is huge, is the fact of, if we couple all three of those factors together, I mean, this is a big, how are you teaching? How are you discipling?
Is your interpretation of that that is primarily related to just the turnover that's happening, like people moving churches because of post-COVID and all that, or primarily just because people are giving less, or some combination of those?
So this means they gave nothing in 2024.
So but you don't know if they were there or not.
They may still be.
But most likely they weren't there.
If someone gave and then stopped giving, my guess is they're either not there physically or they're not there as far as
Supporting the organization.
right being in with the organization.
Yeah. So it's probably speaks to high turnover.
We also know that the data shows us that boomers are leaving the church faster than any other generation right now.
Yeah.
And most of them, when they move to another city to be with where their grandkids aren't plugging back in based upon what the data, it's not our data, but other research is showing us. The amount of flipping around churches is enormous. And so there's just a lot of different factors. The other thing that I do believe is true, Keith, is, and what we see is, so those in our system we can identify. So James gave a first gift, or 6 of y'all gave a first gift, and typically the average church only gets 20% of those people actually give a 6th gift. And so potentially somebody gave a gift in 2021 that was never acknowledged, that was never encouraged, and they're like, this church doesn't need me. And that's one of the implications of that conversation as well. And so developing and cultivating that conversation is so important, because how many of you guys have great first-time attender processes to help that person get plugged in? What's your first-time giver to become an ongoing giver, a committed giver process look like? Probably not much would be my guess. And we believe the best practice would be that your first-time giver's engagement conversation should look an awful lot like your first-time attender journey. Because, I look at it, you may have somebody who gives for the first time who doesn't know that they have the spiritual gift of generosity. And they'll never know that unless it's cultivated. And so how do you step into that?
Just one more question about the turnover thing.
Yep.
And I think I've heard you talk about this before, but just for the whole room. Like, if we're having, over the last 4 years, a lot of people come and go. When new people join your church, can you speak to roughly, because we've had some conversations internally at City View of kind of how long it takes somebody to become a giver or a regular giver, just because I think that my mind has been off on some of that of like what I think's happening versus what's really happening.
So typically what we see is probably in the first, so it depends on who's coming.
Right.
So my guess is if Danny moved from wherever he's attending right now to your church, within a week or two, he would start to give.
Okay.
Once he feels, because that's who he's been.
Right,
That's who he
right,
is.
right.
But typically beyond that point though, it's a 9+ month journey before somebody who, if they've never given before, they may never give if they've never encouraged or challenged, but typically it's closer to a 9-month journey before someone gets that first gift. And then they throw something in and just to test the waters. And if nobody responds, the other thing that I see a lot of churches do is they will, tell them, stop. But they will, as soon as someone gives their first gift, they'll send them a beautiful package about how they can give more and how to give more. And I'm like, somebody's just put their toe in the water to test it, and now you're telling them how to dive off the high dive. You got to move into a journey with them so that you build a relationship before you start. Discipleship is something that comes from relationship, not just because someone said, "Give me a try." Danny, you were going to ask something or say something. Now that you're talking,
No, I mean, can you give us all just one sample of a good response to a first-time giver? You know, like,
Yeah.
Because we know what we're doing with first-time visitors, but give us a couple examples of what would be a good response, you think?
So typically what I see so some churches will send out a text to say, hey, really thankful for your partnership.
Okay.
Thank you for your gift.
Mhm.
And some of them will do a video of someone on staff who will send out a note and just say, man, we're so grateful to have your partnership in this, and we'd love to, just be a part of your journey. So it's typically just a
Okay.
very simple conversation. Frankly, it doesn't look a whole lot different than what your first time guest conversation looks like. Because really it's about the third time, typically on the second gift, we would recommend what's it look like for you to invite them into the welcome center to meet somebody and to say, so that you can personally say thank you and hear more about the ministry on the third. So anyway, there's a journey that we can talk through.
Okay. That's
So,
something.
did you have something else? Okay.
Surprising.
What's that?
I said surprisingly, he doesn't have anything.
Keep reading there, keep reading.
So 1% was responsible for 20% of all giving. Does that surprise anybody? 20% is responsible for how much? Roughly 80%. The Pareto rule actually applies it here in giving as well. And so, it's what we find, and actually the dependence on the top 1% is going up right now. What we see. So if you have 100 people in your church who are givers, one person gave 20% of all your gifts. Now, depending on the church, that's going to look different. But when we look at this, the implications are, and guess how old most of those people are in that top 1% that we see?
60 plus.
60 plus. And what's true about 60 plus people right now? Retiring, they're moving on to fixed income. They're maybe in their peak earning years right now, which means their peak giving years. But they're moving quickly to where they're asset-based living or social security-based living. What have we taught them regarding giving? Have we taught them cash flow basis giving or wealth, asset, cash flow based giving? Typically most churches will talk about cash flow, but they won't talk about assets. And so, that's something that Donna and I, as Danny said, I've retired.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're looking at, over the next few years, what's it look like to shift from a cash flow based living to a asset based living. Our giving does our giving only go based upon what our cash flow is? Our new cash flow? And if so, then what we do and how we give looks totally different than what it does today.
Can you flesh that out a little bit more? I think I understand what you mean, but like, if you're saying you're moving from a paycheck from a company or something
Right.
to a distribution from an IRA or a pension fund or something like that,
Yeah.
are you saying that you think people who are in that boat would think differently about their giving because
Yes.
it's not income from a job, it's money they're withdrawing from a
Typically, the people that we talk about, they typically, well, I already gave on that money,
Interesting. Okay.
and so why would I give on that money?
Okay.
And so that may not be true for all,
No, that's helpful. I need to hear you say that.
but I think that's one of the keys that we see is the fact that as people are shifting where their dollars are coming from, some of them believe I've already paid, I've already tithed on that, or I've already gave on that.
Even if it's gone up, appreciated 100% through.
What basis, yeah, even though. And there's others who will say, okay, I'm gonna tithe on the portion that it increased. So from the basis up to, so on the growth. And there's others who will say, I'm gonna tithe on the whole thing. The question is what should they do? And why do you believe they should be, how should they be thinking?
That's really helpful, Dwayne. I haven't even thought about that.
Because that's the thing is, the average Social Security payment on an annual basis is what, about 36,000, something in that range. That's if someone's had a pretty solid career. So they've lived and worked and been earning 150,000. Now with Social Security, they're going to get 36,000. Their giving's going to look potentially totally different unless they begin to see all that God's provided to them as part of the conversation instead of just what their current paycheck looks like. Wow. Does that make sense?
Do you? Fuck, I'm just having a conversation.
I'm teasing
with
you.
Dwayne up here.
God
No, I
said-
just haven't even thought about this yet. Like, do you think that? So, would you encourage somebody in that season to tithe on whatever their retirement income is, or would you encourage them to think about asset giving in some other way?
I would encourage both.
Okay.
Because there's, because the thing that is true is people who have started the journey of thinking about what my legacy looks like after my life is over. Most people in that older age group, they think, do I have enough? And what am I going to do with it? And I know I talked to, last week I was at Exponential and Eric and I did a breakout there and somebody asked a question about the great, how many of y'all are expecting the great giveaway? The great wealth transfer to impact your life. I'm glad to see your expectations are probably set properly because even though they say there's $700-800 trillion that are held by boomers and older today, the average boomer doesn't believe that expects to spend it all before they're gone. And the average boomer has one set of expectations about what they'll pass on. And when studies have shown that Gen Z and millennials have a different expectation about what's going to be passed on, and the two are not the same. And boomers do not have a higher expectation of what they're going to pass on than so Gen Z and millennials are hoping for wealth transfer to help shift things, and studies are not showing that is a true statement. So
because boomers aren't doing it.
Boomers have a contentment and a security problem right now. They're not content with the way life is, and so they're going to continue to do more stuff. And they have a security problem is they don't know if they have enough. And you put those two issues together, and it's an interesting cocktail. And so one of the things that we need to, the question is are they trusting their 401k or are they trusting Christ? If I talk to the average boomer retiree, the number of times that they've checked their retirement accounts in the past month with the markets moving the way it is, You know, because they're sitting there wondering, do I need to go back to work? Do I need to pick up extra things? Do I need to do all those things? And it's like, so that's, you know, and I can tell you, I feel some of that pressure. But I also will say I haven't looked at my accounts once over the past 4 months because it's just like, God, it's yours. You're going to do with it, and I'll do whatever I need to from that standpoint. But that's not the journey that most people are on. So, so just recognize that's part of the conversation as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for the record, like Kathy and I we've been thinking through all that, and it is fascinating to go from, you know, paid salary to, okay, now my income is kind of coming in different ways, and how much of all that. And so I'm not sure we've done well in the whole asset part, but in terms of whatever we're drawing from investments, you know, we're just taking that and, you know, whatever percentage of giving that we give, you know, we just do it off of whatever we're trying to live on that month. So whether it's coming from, you know, association compensation or coming from investments or whatever, you know, just doing it that way, but it is different.
The other thing to recognize, you guys already know this, savers don't become spenders, savers don't become givers. If they've never been discipled towards giving, when they have $2 million in the bank, they're not going to probably start then. And that's the thing that, you know, you guys know as well as I do, the number of people who say, well, when I reach this point, I'll start to give. That same conversation is taking place in this conversation as well. So, how much time do I actually have?
11:30.
Okay, perfect. Here's what it takes for, if one boomer leaves your church, here's how many Gen Zs and millennials it takes to replace them in current giving. Any surprise?
Would you see someone, a pastor, actually sharing that stat with the church?
You know, the problem is,
How would you?
I could see doing that, except for the boomers would pat themselves on the back and say, millennials and Gen Z, step up the pace. And that's not the conversation here.
Right.
The conversation is, frankly, boomers have not discipled Gen Z and millennials on what giving means. So one of the challenges that I see, and I talked to somebody about this last week, is who is a faithful giver, but he has 3 young kids at home, and they give online recurring gifts. His kids never experience mom and dad worshiping through giving. So, trust me, I'm all for recurring gifts, but if we don't help our parents learn how to disciple their kids in this conversation, their kids are not ever going to know that mom and dad are putting a ACH transfer of $10,000 a month, whatever the number is, to the church.
Yeah.
Kids aren't going to be clueless about that. And I look back at my kids and I'm like, dang, I screwed up. Because I didn't, you know, Don and I have given faithfully for years, but we never thought about how do we pull the kids together and actually disciple them in that. And so there's other issues that are at play here as well. How many Gen Z and millennials expect to own a home?
Decreasing.
It's decreasing. Average age of home buyers right now is 35 years old. Danny, when did you own your first house?
21, 22.
25 for me. And wealth generation typically comes through home ownership.
Yep.
And so the number of studies I've seen that there's at least 5 cities in the U.S. where it's cheaper to rent than to own a home is staggering to me. And so the issues facing these folks regarding income, and I talked to a couple of different folks as I talked to different people. You know, they just love to enjoy life. And so they're getting focused on experiences. And so, hey, how do I jet off to this spot instead of how do I build wealth? I mean, the number of things that Donna and I put off because we were focused on owning a home and those kinds of things. The younger generations, at least some of the stuff I see, and I actually see some of it in my kids, is we're going to go do these things and we'll worry about that because we don't see it as a possibility right now. And so there's those kinds of issues that are in play regarding just generational approach in this. The other thing is, do millennials and Gen Zs trust organizations, institutions?
No.
Do boomers? Boomers typically do until an organization doesn't prove trustworthy.
Right.
Younger generations don't trust an organization until it's proven trustworthy. So transparency and accountability matter tremendously to millennials and Gen Zs. You know, are you mission aligned? Do they know where the dollars are going? They want a voice in where dollars are going. It's a kick funder, generation. They would love. I mean, if you could put a GoFundMe up to fund a few of your ministries, you probably have no shortage of people giving money for that. But they don't want to fund brick and mortar. Studies show they don't care about brick and mortar. And so the challenge is, how do you fund brick and mortar into the next? Now, also, a bunch of people say they'll shift over time. But the question is how long will that shift take? So, Keith, I'm sure you've got something to run around.
No, you answered a lot of it. I was just curious how much of that was related to like the income net worth between generations. The differences is huge.
It's
huge.
huge.
It could just be the fact that like a boomer has 10x the net worth of a Gen X person. But I also understand, like we were talking about earlier, like my kids, for sure, like even though we have taught them model tithing, talked to them about it since they started their first jobs, even now, like as young adults are like, I want to give to this cause or this social justice initiative or whatever, to the water well thing that Holland said earlier.
Right.
So, which is wild to me, growing up in a pastor's home, involved in the local church, seeing us model that, but like, where's the disconnect of like, that's why I asked what I asked earlier about just the value of the local church.
Yep, and that's back to the tithing conversation.
Mm-hmm.
These guys see tithing as an whatever conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Boomers are more likely to see tithing as
A local church.
the local church first.
Yeah.
And so there's a ton of studies out there that will say the younger generations actually give a lot. They're just not giving to the church. Because the church isn't talking to them about mission.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nonprofits are asking them to come alongside and help define how it's used. Is the church? I mean, so there's all these things that, it's one of those things where if you have a stewardship committee or a stewardship group and you don't have Gen Z and millennials on there, you're missing the boat. Because how they think about it, most average stewardship committees that I'm aware of are hosted by Gen X and older. Gen X thinks more like boomers than it does millennials and Gen Zs. And so if you've got a stewardship group, you need to invite those younger people into that conversation. Colin?
So on that note, these are people who we say don't understand stewardship. But we're saying let's give them a voice and a seat at the table in deciding how your stuff is
Because
stewarded.
if you don't do that, how are you ever going to speak to them and engage them so that they can understand? Because so I totally understand where you're coming from, Holland. You've got to disciple them.
Mm-hmm.
So don't just invite them in without a discipleship plan, but disciple them while you're giving them a voice. Because how you talk about things, like one of the things that we believe is, if you're sending out quarterly newsletters, and you're sending out the same newsletter to the boomers and the Gen Z and millennials, you're missing one of the two audiences.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. I mean, they think totally differently. And so if you're trying to, if you're doing a giving moment, you better have a giving moment that one week that appeals to an older generation, but you better hit the next generation the next time. So you've got to think differently about how, because communicating this conversation cannot be the same for both.
Yeah.
So if that wasn't enough, I've got a couple additional insights. So the good news is the number of good new givers is increasing. But the amount they give is less. So the studies, so what our data shows, Colin, just so you know, is that actually the number of Gen Z and millennial givers is increasing at a really great rate. The challenge is they're replacing boomers. And they're not coming in at a 10-to-1 or a
Right.
3.4-to-1 ratio.
Right.
And so your best givers are leaving the building. And they're being replaced by people who either won't or can't give in the same way. So as church leaders, we've got to begin to, so like I said, the great news is actually they're coming and they're beginning to give. But are they being encouraged in their giving? And are they being challenged in their giving?
That's good. Yeah.
And so that's the conversation that he's having. And I'll just say, as I've talked to different people about discipleship, I typically will ask them, so tell me, how do you disciple someone regarding giving? So if you're sitting down with a couple people face to face and having conversations, how are you having that conversation? I ask one, I look at it, it's like, if you knew a guy was having trouble with porn was an issue, would you have a conversation with him about porn? And most people say yes. One person said, I don't think I would. I'm like, okay, we're not talking discipleship then. But then I'm like, why aren't you talking about probably as big or a bigger issue with half the men in the world?
Yeah.
Who see money as their answer as opposed to Jesus as their answer.
For sure.
So how can you disciple without addressing this issue? And actually, the current elder chair of Hill Country, I think, still hates me for challenging him in that way one day. So, but I mean, it's a core conversation.
Yeah.
Can I ask a theological question? This may, I don't know. I don't want to take us off the rabbit trail. So if you want to shut this down and go back to the slide, that's
Yeah.
fine. But no, I just wondered too, like on the generational thing. And I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this. If there was more of an emphasis on tithing, like an actual 10% as a spiritual discipline 2 or 3 generations ago, has shifted more to a grace giving type approach of tithing Old Testament, New Testament is more as you feel led by the Spirit, and that may have nothing to do with
It has. I
What
think
you're
it's
talking
part
about,
of the conversation.
I'm processing that through the lens of what you just said about how we disciple people into
Yep.
giving. It's a lot easier to sit down and tell somebody you should give 10%. But I'm just curious if you have felt that like generationally at all. If there's been more of is the younger generation more like you made that application that was institution kind of based, like anti-institutionalism, more want to be tied to the need. But I'm just wondering, theologically, is it also tied to? I don't really feel like tithing is a biblical command
There
or
were
tradition.
two things. One is that, I think the older people did have kind of a 10% tithe, the technical meaning in mind,
Mm-hmm.
and they had local church as priority in that. So I think that's a lot of where our churches have been. Here at Pflugerville, I always said, hey, the Old Testament saint was given more like 24% of their money.
Once you put all of the different
Yep.
ceremonial
Exactly.
gifts together, yeah.
And so we're not under that obligation, but in place of that is what now the Holy Spirit directs us, which many times is going to be beyond 10%. But it's up to you to determine before God what your percentage is. And so I said that if you're new to giving, 10% is a great place to start thinking.
There you go.
So, I would say that, but I would stop short of that's God's command that you give that. And that don't be surprised that God's Spirit doesn't lead you to give, beyond that. And then we also taught that giving to parachurch mission organizations was always over and above that standard tithe, however you define it, to the local church. But that's why I appreciate Dwayne's point about, hey, these younger generations have moved away from that priority, and they're more cause-driven than church-driven. So I think that they need education about that, and boomers haven't done it. But those are the two things that I see. That's how I always communicate it.
No, I really appreciate you saying that. I think for us as as pastors, just like hearing somebody like, how did you articulate this, or how do you say this? I've just wondered that generationally, because as I've talked to like my parents or grandparents and my kids, just there's a lot of changes in the way they think about all that.
I totally agree, and I think, having for me, I grew up in a church that was probably closer to a Baptist influence, and so it was much more of a do these things conversation, which my parents obviously didn't get, and I didn't interpret either, but totally agree with where Danny's at is like, this is never, but it's like if you're submitting your entire check or your entire paycheck to Jesus, he should tell you where to distribute it. And that's a totally different concept, that you'd actually submit that under Christ.
Yeah, because now you're helping people evaluate, well, how much should I give to entertainment? How much should I give to, what percentage of my housing, what percentage, to savings? Yeah, it's the idea that it all belongs to the Lord.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the key thing, is if we can help everyone understand it all is God's. And the thing is,
But I also love the concrete nature of like even your testimony at the beginning of you're like at that promise keeper thing, and somebody says you need to tithe.
Yeah.
And something about the specificity of that helped you to like, will I tithe? Why am I not tithing?
right. And so and that's where I love what Danny said is it's probably going to look a lot like at least the minimum of this.
Yeah.
Because I do love the specificity of it. And, the part of the journey for me that I love is the fact that if Donna had taken a spiritual gift test when we were presented that conversation, giving would not have been that. When she takes it now, it's one of her top spiritual gifts. Sorry.
Wow, that's huge.
But that's what helps me understand. We've got a lot of people in our churches who don't know that they have that spiritual gift. And no one's ever challenged them to grow in that gift. And so, why not? Why not?
And I'll just add real quick as a humble Gen Z church planter, that moment you just had, I think is what my generation wants to see. Is not just, is it true? And I think my generation needs to learn to re-ask that question. Is truth does exist and it does matter, but they've moved on from is this true to is this actually good? Is this actually helpful? Does this actually make a difference in your life? So to see you say, no, my life personally was impacted, and my wife's life was impacted personally when we started giving not just to causes, but to the local church. I think hearing that with, here's the biblical teaching, is what makes the difference for my generation.
That's really good. That's really good. Thank you.
Good, Brad.
Thank you.
So continuing givers represent 75+% of your giving. So new givers is not going to be your answer. Let's just be clear about that.
One-time givers, you mean?
But if you go back to the 50% didn't give, if you don't have new givers coming in, you're not, so it's a both and conversation. So does that make sense? People who've been a part of your journey, who are invested with you, is where the majority of your giving is coming from. So don't overlook them. And cultivate that and develop them.
Yeah.
But also recognize you've got to build into the next set folks.
So Dwayne, I was curious, related to this, what you shared earlier about instead of doing, automatic withdrawals or all electronic giving, the power of your kids seeing you. I mean, that is so countercultural today in the giving world today.
Well, and I can't say that I buy that passing a bucket or a plate is the answer either. But I think that's where I think each church should think through in their expression. How do you encourage couples, families to think about what they're giving is, and how is that an act of worship, and how do they develop that in their kids? I've got a good friend of mine who got means, but he's for years he's had a foundation or a DAF that he's puts money into, donor advised fund, and his family gets around the table and they talk about where that's above his tithe, but they talk about on a regular basis where that money's gonna go.
Right.
I don't know if you guys know Zach Fetter or not, one of the guys over at Hill Country. He tells a story that his parents did that as well.
Mm.
And his dad gave him like $1,000 to go invest in whatever he thought he wanted to invest in. And the story is kind of funny, but it gave him a great learning, because what he went and invested in was when Lance Armstrong, the Livestrong was really big. So he went and did that. And as he reflected on that a couple of years later, he realized, he went there because he was such a Nike guy, and it had associated with Nike. And so it just points to where your heart is, that's where your trade. And so, but it was a key learning for him, and for his dad to engage him in that part of the journey was key. So there are a lot of different techniques that you can use, but it's not the conversation about, hey, as the plate passes, they see you drop a check or a wad of cash in the plate or in the bucket. It's about the journey and the conversations about where and how. And so my friends' kids know that they tithe what they tithe, but they also know they now do this above and beyond conversation. So there's a couple myths, and I don't know if they're myths. I don't think they're. Myth one is churches can continue to rely on baby boomers to provide the majority of funding for the church's financial goals and objectives. The answer is obviously no, because there's two things that are true about boomers. The boomers are beginning to die. Sorry, but it's true. And so, actually the two oldest generations, the two generations before, our data reflects that over the last 7 years, those two generations have almost become non-existent in the data. So the older generations, the greatest generation and the silent generation, are they're graduating up to heaven, hopefully. But the boomers are right there on their tails. And so they're moving to fixed income, whether it's through their investments or through Social Security, and they're approaching the end of life. And so this one is obviously false. But there are some things that we need to be doing with those guys, and it's talking to them about wealth, not about cash flow. So how many of them know that if they're age 70 and a half, they can give from their IRA and actually be way better off from their standpoint as well as the church's standpoint? And so if you don't understand that, basically, if Danny's got an IRA and he knows he's gonna give $10,000 out of it, if he cashes that out and then gives the remainder of that $10,000, that's a whole lot less than if he transfers directly from his IRA that $10,000 to the church. And so it never hits Danny's taxes that money was given, and it goes directly to the church. And so that's a huge piece that's there. I already talked about it, but we have to address the tension between long-term security and their growing balance sheets. Traditionally, what data shows is boomers get concerned, but their balance sheets continue to grow up and to the right. And so they're always wanting more and not sure that they have enough, but history shows that even with all the downturns and everything, that it's always up and to the right over time. we've gotta challenge the boomers to think about end of life giving. You know, the interesting thing about someone who puts a church in their will is they actually begin to give more today than what they did prior. And so it's a both and. And think about, you know, is there an endowment that you might want to consider so that they can actually endow their giving for a season beyond their life? So I think one of the questions we're trying to understand is, I don't know how long it's going to take for millennials and Gen Zs to be at a spot where they're ready to replace the giving of the boomers. So what does the church need to do to be prepared in that interim period? And we already talked quite a bit about this, but millennials and Gen Z will increase their giving as their income increases and will replace the giving of baby boomers and Generation X. Maybe. I think a lot of it's going to come down to how do we disciple them.
Yep.
You know, most of them have never had financial literacy. They don't understand delayed gratification. They have their smartphones.
Can you go back? You move real quick.
One more.
No, that one's perfect.
I'll send these slides out. But go ahead.
Thank you.
You've got to give them opportunities for them to give, to make an impact. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he's in a group of Gen Zs, and a small group of Gen Zs, and they all decided they wanted to pay off the debt of somebody in their group, their medical debt of somebody in their group. So they all did a GoFundMe and paid off the debt. And now all of a sudden they're ready to go start giving more. And so it's something small, tangible like that actually starts to feed the conversation. Holland?
I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, because part of like the second statement here, to give for impact, not organizational capacity. Like
Yep.
some of the comments you made before too about like people don't want to give to brick and mortar and things. Yeah, everyone, like you also mentioned before, one of the most important parts about developing wealth, generational wealth, is home ownership, brick and mortar for your family. And maybe like I think discipling in the impact of having, you know, having a brick and mortar building that can last beyond your generation, and you know, teaching how the legacy of a church existing in this place over the next 50, 100, 200 years will make a lasting impact for the kingdom.
So how you just did that, Holland, is what we would see would be a best practice, because
Amen.
because what we find a lot of churches do is, hey, we're doing this project, we're doing this, people don't want to fund staff. They don't want to.
That's a problem to me too. I'm like, that's so important to pay your pastor, you know.
Totally agree. But I think the thing that they want to fund is the impact that the church is making.
Yeah.
And so how you talk about the fact that you can make an impact because of your brick and mortar. So the churches that we're talking to that are in downtown, major metropolitan downtown areas, old areas, they know the boomers are disappearing. They're trying to figure out what the heck do we do?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what we're talking to them about is, one is right now, you probably need to work with some of your boomers to actually fund the next few years while you develop and pour into the next generation, but helping your next generation actually understand why those buildings matter is not because you want a presence, it's because you want to make an impact. Mm-hmm. And having those conversations. So that statement, so thank you for calling it out, is it's about how do you rephrase organizational capacity into an impact statement instead of just talking about, hey, you know, when you're doing your budget, when you're presenting your budget, talking to them about the fact of, we're putting this much into repaving our parking lot. Who wants to fund repaving the parking lot? But what can you do because of repaving that parking lot is what you've got to talk about. And so that's really what that statement is trying to address, Holland, is changing it from that perspective. Think about your giving solutions. You know, we're talking to churches who are implementing Apple Pay as one of the options for people to give.
Use Cash App.
Use Cash App, whatever, so that you move beyond and take a look at your giving pages. Most giving pages tell you how to give. They don't tell you why to give or what the impact of your giving is.
That's good.
And if you're not addressing that, so accountability and transparency matters tremendously. And the other piece that I would say is, if you're part of ECFA and you've got something, the good badge from them, or you've got an audit that you can say, we review, this stuff is reviewed on an annual basis, that matters in this conversation. And so those are some of the things that would recommend re-looking at your giving pages to think about the fact that, is it telling you how to give? Or is it telling you why and where? And those should be the focus on giving pages. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's good.
Because it changes the conversation, because the average person who's not sure that why they're giving, and they stumble upon a church page that talks about giving, or it says the give page, half the time it's give page. I've actually recommended multiple churches change give page to giving page and turn the focus into why giving matters, and it does make a difference. We've recently, and I can send this out to you guys, but we've got a piece that talks about next gen generosity, and so one of the guys on the team is actually, he's a gift strategist as well as engages and coaches with churches, but he's put together a piece on next generation giving, which I think is a really great piece, and we've had a couple people who are younger people review it, and they're like, yeah, that pretty much represents our generation. And so it's a great piece that'll help you get some insights. I know Eric loaded the report up on Basecamp, thank you. So that's there, but if you guys want to reach out or talk, happy to talk. And it doesn't have to be a Mortarstone conversation, it can just be a, hey Dwayne, tell me what you see and do. But that's really what I got, and hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that, like I told you guys at the beginning, I'm extremely passionate about. I'm also a data guy, and so this is something, we started this 6 months after I joined the organization. We decided to start doing this because it's like, we've got all this data and we need to steward well what God's entrusted us. And the best way we can do that is help equip churches and church leaders understand what are some of the trends that are out there. And I will guarantee you'll talk to a bunch of different people who will have different perspectives on some of the same thing. All I can say is, this is hard data driven, and it's our understanding of the data based that and coupled with outside research. So
It's really, really good. I mean, if we've never really thought about all the implications of boomers dying off and what are the giving trends of the younger generations, it's really good.
yeah, and one thing that we saw is Gen X giving for the first time is greater in 2024 than boomer giving. Never happened before.
To churches.
To churches.
Oh.
Yep. In our sample size.
Oh, I get what you mean. Because of the decline, the number of boomers and the number, yeah.
Yep. And
Yeah.
so
Boomers
Gen
have
X is
finally
in their
died.
top of their earning potential. And we see boomers so we're only gonna see, we believe we're gonna see that slide happen a lot faster. And so that's just part of the conversation, and we still don't see signs that Gen X and millennials are gonna catch up. I mean, Gen Z and millennials are gonna catch up yet, so.
Just real quick, can you give us a few words? I think the distrust thing you mentioned earlier is a big deal, like institutions and
Yep.
the fact that, like a lot of the news reports that go related to churches, church leaders are always things we have to overcome because they're so negative about so-and-so stole money and so-and-so's doing this and whatnot. And so, I kind of know how I try to speak to that, but I'd just be curious to hear like phrases or words or things you think are helpful to like build trust. Like you mentioned the FCA logo or
Yep.
things like that, but just even when you're in a church service, you're pastoring and you're leading giving time, are there phrases or the things to say to just kind of minister to people's hearts that builds their trust in the organization because they probably are skeptical?
So I mean, and I don't know if I can, the typical thing that I see is truly being able to talk about the fact that, we have, talking about the strength of your team, who is actually watching over finances, that they're reviewed by the elders, that you have an external audit. All those things all point to the accountability that's there.
Okay.
And then I think the transparency of, hey, we're grateful for your giving, and here's where some of that's gone. And so being very clear and not being able to just talk about it in a this cloud space, but actually just say, hey, we've invested this much money into these things. And so actually being very clear with some of the numbers so that they understand both the transparency, that transparency matters to you, because I think that's the thing that they're looking for, is that transparency actually matters to you and that accountability matters to you.
Do you think there's a best practice on the transparency side as far as how often you share financial updates to the church?
I think probably every couple months of some level of update would be good.
Dwayne, what would you say to these guys, some of them newer than others in the pastorate, about talking about their own giving habits and practices?
So I do think being able to be just very clear, you don't have to tell them out, but yeah, this is the approach that my wife and I use when we're determining what to give. Is huge. And being able to just talk about the fact that, hey, my wife and I, we've been sacrificially giving, and this is the process that we take when we're doing that, matters a lot, because that's back to the transparency conversation, but also there's accountability in that, because they're like, oh, if that's what Keith's doing, okay, I wonder what I should be doing. And so that's where I would go with that conversation. Yeah, because to say, hey, I gave $5,000 last month. For the average person, depending on the person sitting in your pew, they're gonna say, well, that's not much, or they're gonna say, that's a lot.
No, it's about percentage.
And it's about really the conversation about sacrificial and what does sacrificial mean. Because one of the things that we talk to people about, and it's, if you talk to a lot of people, what is generosity? I mean, define generosity. And I guess if we went around the room, we would probably have, how many people are in this room, we have a different definition of generosity. One of the things that we try to think about is generosity actually means it's a stop and think about a moment. Because if I give this, I'm giving up something. Because there's people in most of our churches who probably could write a $10,000 check today, and it's not gonna matter to them one iota. Is that person generous?
Maybe.
What's that?
It's the woman who gave the two.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so definition of generosity looks a lot different. So actually, the more you can help lean into that conversation and get to that with your people, actually matters, because it truly is. How Donna and I are generous looks different than how Danny and his family is generous. Is different than. But the key is the fact of, I can be generous in one way, Danny can be generous in another way. But the key is the fact of, does it reflect the Father's generosity? Don't tell me the Father didn't think about, I'm actually sending Jesus to the cross. And that's generosity. It's because you have to stop and think about it. Because a $10,000 gift does not mean somebody was generous in your church. And when you communicate that they were generous, hey, we received this generous $10,000, $100,000 gift. You're speaking to different people. And somebody's gonna say, I could never touch that. Somebody else is gonna be like, oh, is that all generosity is? And it's a heart conversation, not a checkbook conversation.
Some of our best conversations with our kids were like leaving church and they want to go, let's go to Double Dave's Pizza, let's go somewhere. And God would say, well, kids, we can't afford that. And I would say, no, we can afford it. But we chose to give away some money for this, and that's why we're not doing it. That gives clarity. How often should these guys be preaching on money, teaching on money?
You guys are probably way better at that than I am, but I think, my sense of it is, it just comes down to, when you have to be transparent about where you're at yourself. The question is there's a lot of people who won't teach on it because they're not comfortable with it themselves. So become comfortable with it yourself, and then teach from what God's teaching you in giving. And when I think about the parable of the barns, when I think about the talents, when I think about 1 Timothy, I mean, all those things are opportunities to talk to people about and engage people in a conversation about what it truly looks like to reflect God and his generosity. And I think that's what we're really wanting. I think that's what we need to do, is help people understand our Father is extremely generous. And we're called to be like him. But what does that look like? And think about that.
I agree with that, but gosh, we've got a greed problem. Like we just have a consumption issue that's like, I mean, we got to your point, be transparent about our battle with that, and then also with our people. Like we are all swimming in 10,000 advertisements every day that are trying to get us to spend money, and it's a hard battle to like. I mean, I love what you said about double days and all that, But man, it's just a battle. It's a battle to give when it's like 50 things are asking for your money, and we're just so tempted to consume.
Yeah.
So I think we got to speak to people's hearts about that.
Yeah, and that's where I love the parable of the barns, because I mean that is just so clear about where our heart should be.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I will say probably Donna and I's hearts, we were way more invested in the church after we started giving, true tithing, than what we were before. And so I think that where your heart and your treasure, it doesn't matter which one God gets a hold of first, the other one has to follow.
Yeah, that's great.
And if you guys are all live in Texas, have you ever heard the story of Sam Houston's baptism?
Yeah.
Do you know the story?
Uh-huh.
So, as the story goes, Sam was being baptized, and as he was being prepared to go under the water, he still obviously had his clothes on and stuff like that. And they said, "Oh, you need to remove all your papers out of your pockets." So he pulled out all his stuff out of his pockets. And then they're like, "Well, what about your wallet?" And his answer was, "My wallet needs baptism to submit to Christ as much as my heart does."
That's awesome.
That's great.
And if all of our people could say the same thing, think about the transformation that would take place. And so, anyway, that's my time's up. But guys, this has been fun. I love talking about this stuff. So I'll shut up because otherwise I'll never leave. But
Food's not here yet, so
Can I
keep talking.
Well, I just was curious to hear from Holland, like from you guys, about is there any of this that, I mean, he's obviously speaking from a lot of the examples that Dwayne gave were, middle class, upper income type environments. You guys trying to minister a more low socioeconomic environment. Do you have to communicate any differently about these things as you communicate in that context?
I was going to say maybe the heart posture of it is the same. The reality and the application of it is very different. As you probably heard, as our congregation increases, our income doesn't increase, only the need. So encouraging them to give, while it creates a good heart posture of understanding that you have to give and training, usually what it does is just revolving door. They're going to give, and then next week they're going to need money for this thing that we're going to have to figure out how we can do that. Application of it is very different for us. Me and Holland were looking at it. He said, when you give out numbers, and we were like, if we get one person that said $5,000, they could give $5,000 1 month, or that $5,000 wasn't a lot of money. It was like, we could be all right. We could
take a couple of those.
Yeah. Very different in that.
But the heart posture, you still got to teach it, obviously, and it's good. And we see, there's really encouraging things. But the widow and the two mites, we got that happening all over in our church, and it's awesome to see the faith and how God is working in their lives when they're faithful to give the $5 that is a sacrifice for them. But at the same time, there's also we pray for a couple anchor families that really understand what generosity looks like, as well as have some more to give. So there's a different application.
Another difference for us is because we are in the lower socioeconomic classes, we don't really have the greed problem. We do have a typically a generous heart people. They really do want to give. The disconnect is between what they have to give and what they want to give.
Mm.
So we don't really have to hit hard on, what generosity looks like and having a generous heart. More so it's just the resources to do that for us.
And I think, so the thing I would say in that, one, thank you, because I totally agree with that, and that's why you have to watch out throwing numbers out.
Yeah,
Because what I can do versus what you can do versus what somebody else can do doesn't, and so that's where talking about the heart issue is key. The other thing is to recognize you're typically not asking people, well, the best thing is don't ask people for money, ask them to do things that cost money.
I think to do,
What's that?
to do what?
To ask them to do things that actually takes money. And so instead of saying, Danny, will you give 10,000? Say, Danny, man, we're working on this project and we want to transform the experience for newcomers. And it's going to take roughly 10,000. Would you like to be a part of transforming this experience for newcomers?
Yeah.
That changes the conversation dramatically in that. And so you're no longer talking to them about giving money. You're actually asking them to come along and do that and engage in those conversations. So.
That's for sure.
All right,
Thanks,
Dre,
James.
thanks so much, man. Oh, James, you had a question earlier or a comment?
So with the onboarding new givers process, like I don't have transparency on who's giving and what they're giving. And so as lead pastor, I don't see any of that information. Is that a shift that like is newer that should happen, or is that like a shift that maybe I've got a boundary up that I shouldn't have as far as like not knowing who gives what?
So,
Or how
so
much
the
they
thing,
give?
James, great question. And what I would say is there's a lot of different views. There's lead pastors all over the place who know what people give, and there's lead pastors all over the place who don't know what people give. The thing I would say is if it's not the lead pastor, you better have somebody who does, who can actually engage in those conversations and begin that piece. But for the first time giver or the new giver journey, you don't have to know what they give. All you have to know is that they chose to invest, and that you can just say, but there's somebody on your team who probably knows. And
Got it.
And I think, and Keith, I know one of the things that you guys, you don't know what people give or anything, but you know Rick does.
Correct.
And your people know Rick does.
Correct.
And so Rick can talk from the front about giving, and people put the weight of Keith behind that. And so if you're not gonna know, you've gotta have somebody that you can actually, that people knows, and that you are in support of that knows. And so that's one of the things I love about what you guys have done is Rick will get up and give a quarterly update on where the church stands, and it's like, that's as good as Keith doing it. And then, the best part about that is when Rick reaches out to somebody, he knows he's reaching out on behalf, but that Keith doesn't know what's going on.
The other thing is, unless you tell people you don't know, a lot of people will assume you do know.
Got it.
Just throwing that out there.
Especially depending on the church context that they came from. There's a lot of churches out there that people know, the lead pastor knows. And so once again, you didn't see it, Connor, but 50% of the people who gave in 2021 did not give again in 2024 to the same church. All those people who have shifted have now carried your perspective to the next church, or carried the previous church to the current church.
Sure.
And so if the last guy knew, they're going to perceive Keith knows unless Keith talks about it. And if the last guy didn't know, so anyway, it's all those things that are going to be important.
I want to state something I think probably is obvious for all of us, but one, we found that when our elders are consistently praying for this issue, we see spiritual movement in the space. So just not praying about it like as in, Lord, help us pay the bills, but like as in, Lord, help our people's hearts be freed up from the love of money. God does work in that space. So that might seem obvious, but let's don't jump over that. Two, like when people become new believers, they get baptized or everything else, it's part of their discipleship process. I know we've kind of alluded to that, but like that's been big because they're more willing to give a lot of times than people who've been in church a long time, not practicing that. New believers, it's like part of their discipling. And I say that specifically because we just had a guy who came to faith, and I shared some of this, I think, actually on the retreat for some of you, where he came to faith And he walks up to me the day he comes to faith and hands me a big wad of cash. And I'm like, okay, I'm thinking like maybe he got it from like drugs or I didn't know. It was like wrapped up in a ponytail holder. And he said, Jesus wants me to surrender my entire life to him. And I've
Sam
been
Houston.
It sounded like that, right?
Yeah.
And he said, I've been putting my trust in money. And he wants me to put my trust in him.
Wow.
And so
And
that's a
so-
story.
So then we share that with the
Yeah,
congregation.
exactly.
Here's a brand new believer.
Yeah.
You talk about grab their hearts, right? And so
Yeah.
telling those stories and
Storytelling
celebrating.
is huge in this
Yeah,
conversation.
and celebrating
It's
like
good.
this is what God wants. It's not just, you know. So anyway,
That's
be
good.
encouraged, be encouraged.
That's
Yeah.
good.
I remember you telling that story. It's powerful.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll pray and for lunch. And again, Dwayne, thanks, man.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Dwayne.